Okay, Paul, go ahead.
Okay. There. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters. It's a pleasure to welcome you to the Book of Mormon Perspectives Forum again in this warming up springtime day of April 2023. Whoop, we're still in March. Well, looking ahead, and we have interesting things coming ahead. But for this evening, our presenter is Stephen Smith. He and Jody are in Lamoni, Iowa, and they're going to be sharing with us about Joseph Smith III, who moved to the newly constructed Liberty Hall in Lamoni, Iowa in 1880. Stephen serves as the site administrator and will present the later portion of the RLDS prophet's life in his tour of the site. Stephen's father, Harold, and mother, Mildred, traveled extensively to Mexico looking for Book of Mormon evidences. And by the way, if I recall correctly, they were the ones that established the mill at Nauvoo, which produced the marvelous sorghum cookies, which last year had been discontinued by the new mill operators. Very disappointing. But the Smiths of Nauvoo, who are the parents of Stephen, left a major significant legacy just in that appetizer for me. Anyway, Stephen extends the heritage that he has in exploring church history by his stewardship of Liberty Hall, the legacy of Joseph Smith III. And so we welcome Steve and Jody if she's available this evening. It's a pleasure to have the people who know a great deal about a given topic as our presenters, and that is the case tonight. And so join me in prayer, please. Originator of light, love, atoms, galaxies of mystery, we bow in awe and reverence as we look at a snapshot of your gentle influence in the arc of history, recognizing your awesome power in the infinite multiverse of creation and its profound intent in shaping the nature of our nation. Wherein the restoration gospel has found place to put down roots and grow for numerous seasons, touching the lives of millions of people for multiple reasons, but especially in bridging our mortal sense to prospects of immortality and apprehending that our lives serve to fulfill your intentionality. This evening, as we look at the pictures of Joseph III and the historic site of Liberty Hall, we ask your spirit to renew within us the clarion call to embrace and build intellectual cause, to activate within us the urge and purpose to extend our efforts without pause, implement righteous judgment to feed and educate the children, recognizing that each has worth, caring for each other and our mother, the beautiful island we call Earth. Bless Stephen Smith, our presenter. Bless our participants as we review our role in your historic plan. And magnify within us, dear Lord, desire to be, to do, to embody utopia as best we can. In the name of Jesus, divine mystery, guides us through radiance toward immortality. Amen. Steve, now I should be able to get out of screen sharing and provide the opportunity for you. I'm circles, but I think maybe that's what I'm going to do.
Paul, I can hear you, but I can't seem to get into the meeting to share my screen. And it won't let me join on my main computer. So I'm on my phone right now.
My screen share may have been intruding, so try again and see if it'll work now.
Okay, let me see if I can get back into it.
Your sound is okay by phone, so this is okay.
Okay,
But you must be using, you're not making a phone call, Steve, and that's the ultimate backup, is to make a phone call and use just the audio. But you go ahead and see what you can do. You weren't able to send the PowerPoint to me?
well, Rick, Robert, when I launch the meeting, if I go in on, if I go into Zoom on my phone, then, and I have the phone number and ID number that you gave me, but how do I use that?
Get out of Zoom, and you're making a standard plain old phone call.
Okay,
And it will come back with a message that says, type in your meeting number.
okay, let me try. Okay,
But that won't get us the PowerPoint unless you send it to one of us, to me, hopefully, because you've got an email from me if you can attach it and send it.
okay, let me see if I can. I apologize, everybody. Let me see if I can do that. Let's see. It won't let me join on my main computer, so let's see. So
While he is negotiating to resolve that issue, then let me share with you momentarily. You will see over my shoulder that my wife is smiling on us, and I anticipate that that will be perpetual. It's been nice to have her smiling on me every once in a while. And yesterday, in the celebration of life, it became rather poignant because one of the ladies speaking indicated that she'd never heard Rena angry. Well, I have, and so I announced that, and it got a laugh. But I think anybody that lives together 52 years is going to experience a range of emotion, and we certainly did. But it was interesting to me that angry for Rena was not particularly harsh. Just an amazingly tolerant person. Anyway, I do want to express again my appreciation to the remarkable support that our family has received in the last 3 weeks from everyone with their cards and emails, and appreciation for the radiance of this little lady that's been my wife for the last 52 years. Thank you very much. I do also want to put in a plug for next week. I need someone who would be willing to present a 10-minute brief on, or less, on the resolution about Christian Zionism. And we have my brother working on resolution on marriage. I'm planning to do the one on peace, on the Peace Church, and we have the resolution on refugees covered by Bill Gunlock. But if there's somebody that would volunteer to review that resolution on Zionism, I would very much appreciate it if we get at least a 5 to 10 minute review of that. It's a comparatively brief resolution, and is presented largely from a European perspective. So it's one that Americans have some tendency to have difficulty to appreciate. So therefore, there's some coverage, and I would appreciate if we had some to help with that coverage.
All Wanda has put in the chat that she, or pardon me, Wednesday has put in the chat that she would do it. Wednesday Jones.
Thank you, Wednesday. Great.
Thank you, Wednesday.
Yes, that's very nice to volunteer. That means next week then that we'll have those 4 resolutions to be reviewed as our forum presents, And that will conclude the preliminary efforts. We'll then have the follow-up on the 1st of May to let people know what has happened to those resolutions in the conference. All right, Steve, we're getting any success to come through, or maybe I need to ask Robert because he's looking for an email or telephone call.
Steve just dropped out, which is promising because he got in on Zoom, which is not at all what I had intended, and I'm hoping that he can proceed to make a plain old telephone call to the number I gave him. You haven't seen his phone number come in, have you, Deb?
No, I've got Ron's iPhone and Kathy's iPhone, but those are the only two phones I've got.
Okay. But even those, if they were I think it's just not getting through that you can make a plain old telephone call to one of the Zoom numbers, and it will start off by saying, this is the Zoom system, type in your meeting number, and you type it in on the keypad and you're in, but you can only listen to sound and talk. You obviously can't see anything, and we can't see you, but that's always the ultimate backup. But Steve, I don't know if he's trying that or not. I'm not seeing any emails from him. I don't know if I have his phone number. Paul, would you like to see if anybody else here has information about Liberty Hall or experiences that they would be interested in sharing?
Well, yes, we can open the forum for observations. We have people that have toured it, I'm sure, and I have. And I lived just 6 miles from it for most of my growing up years. So I saw it undergo a number of other interesting changes. And I'm anticipating a chance to do some archaeology there. So I'm looking forward to some greater familiarity. But yeah, any of you that have Liberty Hall experience that you'd like to share, that might be a good passover or wait means of clearing until we should get Steve on. It was interesting. Yeah, Earl. Go ahead, Earl.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, I grew up at Lamoni too. I was born there on just east of on Main Street there. So I've went through the house several times, and I had a violin that I played. It belonged to Marcella Shanks, who was an older lady there, and so I donated it to the Heritage House. And however, they verified that it was not Joseph Smith. So, oh well, I lost there. Take care.
One of my fond memories was of the time when Bishop Leslie Coleman and his family lived there. And his son, Richard Coleman, was on the football team so ahead of me, maybe 2 years. And so we got some interaction, but not a whole lot. But in recent years, I heard Richard exclaiming about the frost built up on the windows inside Liberty Hall, and he found there's ice on those windows. And I was able to identify with that because the farmhouse where David and I grew up, ice on the windows was a very common thing, even though the house had been reasonably well insulated. But I think Liberty Hall had not been so well insulated, and at least from Richard Coleman's description, and it was a big house, of course, with a lot more windows to try to shield out the cold, but to have ice thicker than the glass building up on the inside of the windows was not that unusual in Lamoni winters.
Okay, we have Steve back on with us.
Good.
If he can unmute.
And
Either by neither Zoom or by plain old phone call. That
I didn't
Steve, are you
understand.
there? Can you hear us?
I can hear you, yes.
Okay,
I emailed my PowerPoint presentation to Robert. I don't know if Robert got it yet or not.
okay, he's looking. You're coming through loud and clear at the moment.
Steve, I got something under a phone number, 641-442. Is that you?
Uh, um, our no, no. 641-784-6133 is our office number.
No, I got some funny thing and I didn't know if it was you, but I'll keep looking.
Okay, our email here is sometimes slow.
Sure.
Well, without
You want to try to
without-
share your screen, Steve?
I can't. I'm not on the computer.
Oh, you're
I'm
not
my
on the
phone.
computer. Okay.
I can go ahead and share without the pictures, without slides. As Paul has already said, my name is Steve Smith. I'm currently site director at Liberty Hall Historic Site in Lamoni, and I'm not a historian, but I've had a lifelong interest in church history. For the material that I'm presenting tonight, I would acknowledge Roger Lanius's book. I think is the best biography of Joseph Smith III. It's entitled Joseph Smith III, Pragmatic Prophet. It was published by the University of Illinois in 1995. And then, of course, the memoirs of President Joseph Smith III, which was originally a serial publication in the Saints Herald that began in 1934. Who was Joseph Smith III? I don't know to what extent people who are on are familiar with this, so this may be familiar territory with many of you, but let me go ahead. Joseph Smith III was the first and oldest son of Joseph Smith Jr., the founder of Mormonism. He is commonly called Joseph Smith III to distinguish himself from his father, who's sometimes referred to as Joseph the Prophet or Joseph Smith Jr. Joseph Smith III was born in Kirtland, Ohio, on November 6, 1932, and died in Independence, Missouri on Emma Mayfield to Quincy, Illinois. And then he grew up in Nauvoo, and at the age of 18, experienced the death of his father, Joseph Smith Jr., and his uncle, Hiram Smith, and the breakup of the church. He, along with his mother, Emma, and the family, remained in Nauvoo and grew up to adulthood there. In 1860, at age 27, he accepted leadership of what became known as the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or the RL.
Robert, I guess that the
True.
presenter is using an internet connection in spite of a regular old phone call.
I'm sorry. Are you not hearing me well?
No, we're not hearing you well, Steve. You're breaking up.
Okay.
Are you, Steve, are you doing an actual phone call like in the old times with dialing in a number, or are you using internet now for the phone?
I believe this is on the internet.
That's why you are breaking up. Robert sent you an email, and there you have instructions in it to type in and to make a telephone conversation. And then, as in his email says, you will hear this is Zoom systems. Type in the meeting number, and then the number that Robert sent you as meeting number. You type it in on the keypad, and there you are. And then you can speak and listen. And then, in that case, it will be the best for the sound. And in that case, when Robert has your PowerPoint, Robert can share your PowerPoint to us all.
Well, I can try. Can you tell me what the phone number is? I have Robert's phone number, but that's not the phone number you're talking about. What is the phone
No,
number for?
No, the phone number was in an email, but I can give it to you if you wish to write it down.
Is that the 271-495-8353?
No, that's the meeting number.
Okay, just a second. Let me see if okay, let me go back.
I'd be happy to give it to you again.
Okay, well, just go ahead and do that.
646
Yes,
558
yes.
8656.
Okay,
Just call that number,
okay, I will try.
and then it'll ask you for a meeting number and use that 271.
Okay. I'll hang up here.
Yes,
I'll leave this meeting. I'm sorry. I'll have to go back
yes.
to it. Okay.
Aspie, thank you for repeating what I was saying. Sometimes it's very helpful to have a second person say the same thing.
No problem, Robert. I'm here to help whenever I can.
Thank you.
In this pause, I would call to your attention that we have an open spot in April for a presentation if there's somebody who would volunteer one.
Okay, I think we got him.
This is Steve Smith.
Okay, we got you.
Um,
Can you hear us, Steve?
yes, I can hear you. I'm just trying to decide how to proceed.
Well,
Let me-
just pick up where you left off, okay? And
Okay.
the minute I get your slideshow, I'll let you know.
Okay. Well, I'd like to help you, I think, to understand Joseph and his presidency. We need to go back to Joseph as a young man, growing up in Nauvoo. He was, as a typical kid, he was mischievous, would get into trouble. I can give you some of those examples, but and he loved fishing and baseball. As a matter of fact, one of the stories, he loved to fish and fished throughout his life, including here at Liberty Hall. And one of the stories was after he became president of the church in 1860, a church member who joined the church while his father, Joseph Smith Jr., was president, came to visit him and wanted to find out if he was a true prophet or not. Well, when he came to Nauvoo, he searched around, finally found Joseph fishing in the Mississippi River. And this prior church member was quite upset and asked Joseph how he was supposed to, he didn't look like, he says, you don't look like a prophet to me. You're not doing anything presidential. How am I supposed to make a decision? And Joseph said, well, how did you make a decision about my father? And the member said, well, I prayed about it. The Holy Spirit confirmed that to me. And so Joseph Smith III said, why don't you do the same for me? And that he did, and he became a faithful member of the reorganization. His philosophical bent was expressed early in life. When he was 12 years old, and when I give you ages, recognize that he was born on November 6th. So during most of the time, he will say of his own ages, for example, when his dad died, when his dad was killed, Joseph will say he was in his 12th year, which means also that he's 11 years old going on 12. So when he was 13 years old, in his 13th year, 12 years old, he made for himself rules of behavior. And although they were on the PowerPoint, the one that I really caught my attention was never attempt anything but what you can do openly, free from fear of consequences. 10 years later, when he was writing a friend, Emma Knight, who was struggling with religion and wanted to know how to approach religion, he said to her, why don't you do the same things I'm doing? And he said, examine all doctrines faithfully and carefully weigh the merits and demerits before you commit yourself. Live uprightly and honestly before the world, having a conscience void of reproach. And if you do, you are Christian, whether you had joined the tenets of any church or not. Now, of course, he's not president of the RLDS Church at this time, but we will hear later he had quite an ecumenical bent. And I was struck by that he would say, you are Christian if you've done those things, whether you joined a church or not. How he came to be president of the RLDS Church was a fairly long process. It was in 1853, he had an experience in which he saw a vision. He was upstairs in the mansion house in Nauvoo, up in the southwest bedroom corner. At least that's, I believe, where it happened. And he says that he was sitting or lying on his bed, and all of a sudden the walls of the room disappeared. And the first scene he saw was of a busy marketplace in town with courts and everything going on. And he comments that it was the kind of scene where a man can make his mark in the world, be successful. And then the scene changed, and he says he was looking at prairie land, not a mountain or river in evidence, but it was an extraordinarily peaceful place where people were happy living in farms and homes. And as he commented to a person who appeared to be in the dream, in this vision with him, about how happy those people looked, that personage in the vision said to him, "Note carefully that this child, you're going to have to make this decision." I'm going from memory here. It's in the PowerPoint, but he said you're going to be faced with this decision soon. You're going to have to make a decision which of those two options you want. Once you make that decision, you cannot go back. That is your fate for your life. So that was in 1853. He then in 1853 decided to go practice law. You can decide how he may have reacted to that vision, but he decided to go practice law. And so he went to Canton, Illinois, and studied law there. While he was there, Lania says he drank deeply of the waters of frivolity, cheap cigars, and liquor. And once in a while got in trouble while he was there. So his mom, Emma, and her second husband, Major Bideman, said to him, "Come home. We're not going to pay for any more of your reading the law there because you're not living the way we think you should be living." So he came home. But that legal influence, you'll find, follows him throughout his role as presidency as well. Well, a number of things happened, but the next major one was 3 years later, 1856. He had begun farming, and he and Emmeline, his first wife, were living on the farm. And he had friends there, Mr. Putnam and his son, Christian and Putnam Yates. I'm sorry, last name was Yates. Anyway, they were good friends. They were not members of the church. And they began to say to Joseph, "Maybe you should go to Utah. You'd be fully accepted there, and you can have all the wives you want. You might consider that." So he was trying to think about that in his own mind, saying, "Am I just bigoted about polygamy, or is this something that's even possible that that's what God wants us to do?" He says while he was working in the field, he had a second vision, much like his father's first vision in some ways. A light descended out of the sky, brighter than the bright summer day that was surrounding him. And in that vision, he was talked to and was told that he should, let me quote it, I have it in my notes here. He said he was told to have nothing to do with Utah Mormonism because the light in which you stand is greater than theirs. So for him, that closed the question of whether he should go to Utah. And interestingly enough, when the Utah missionaries visited him later that year, they went away and told Brigham Young, "No, that's over with. He's not going to join us, so don't worry about it." So there was kind of a divorce. He was no longer interested in Mormonism, and the Mormons were no longer interested in him. Well, later that year, in 1856, two missionaries came from our LDS church, Samuel Gurley and Edward Briggs, and they brought a message to him from the new organization, commanding him to come and accept leadership of the church. Well, Joseph III didn't respond very well to that and got very angry and would have kicked them out of the house except for his wife, Emmeline, who calmed things down and said, "Okay, sit down and have supper with us. And tomorrow we'll come into Nauvoo and the mansion house and we'll talk about this." So they did. But Joseph III decided, he said, "I'm willing to go, but God's got to tell me. I can't depend on someone else. He has to tell me." And so they left, Gurley left in tears. Edward Briggs, interestingly enough, stayed in Nauvoo, stayed there for a year, worked with Joseph off and on. I'm sure they talked church, but I've always been impressed that he would take a whole year to try to convince Joseph of the rightness of what they were trying to do. Well, in 1859, Joseph by this time had a number of troubles in his life. They had gone bankrupt in Farmington. They had several bad years and had gone bankrupt. And because of that, he was having difficulty with his wife's family because they didn't think he was providing adequately. And his wife, Emmeline, was at that one point close to death. And their second daughter actually did pass away. So while Joseph was praying about why is my life this way, he doesn't describe what happened at that point in time, but said he received a message. I'm just looking in my notes rather than the PowerPoint. Well, I probably should have. Anyway, the message was that the members of the church in Zarahemla who were reorganizing was the only portion of the church was acceptable to him, acceptable to God. And so Joseph felt that he had finally gotten the answer he needed. He got his questions cleared up. So he then writes to William Marks and tells him that he's interested in joining the reorganization if they are interested in him. So William Marks and others comes to visit him, talk to him. William Marks says, if God's called you, we want to know about it. If not, we want nothing to do with you. Well, Joseph III apparently convinced him that he believed God had called him. And so they went to the conference in Amboy, 1860, and on April 6th was accepted and ordained as president prophet of the church. Well, as president, one of the things that really stuck out in his presidency was his strong antagonism towards Brigham Young Mormonism and to plural marriage or polygamy. That started when he was a young man, even a kid growing up still in Nauvoo, between 1844 and 1846, while the church was breaking up. A great hostility developed between Brigham Young and Emma Smith and the family. And Joseph III, his perception of that was that their family was being persecuted and that Brigham Young was responsible for that. So he was always antagonistic towards Brigham Young. With regard to the polygamy, you'll recall that in Nauvoo, there were basically two different churches going on. One was a small group of select people who were being taught polygamy and temple ordinances, and then other members of the church, a larger group that was being told, no, we do not practice polygamy and never have, and that's all hogwash. Well, there was a third way to look at that, and William Marks kind of represents that way. He says that in his experience, he was stake president in Nauvoo during this time, and that as stake president, Joseph came to him and that Joseph had been teaching and practicing polygamy, but that Joseph said to him, this is in 1844, right before his death, Joseph said to him, polygamy is going to destroy the church. We've got to root it out. And if you'll go after those who are practicing polygamy, I will support you as president of the church. Well, that never came about because Joseph was killed shortly thereafter. Joseph III was never seems to have picked up on that, and it wasn't a part of his thinking or teaching in the church. His reasoning, Joseph Smith III's reasoning, was that his father was a good and decent man, and that a good and decent man would not teach or practice plural marriage, and therefore he couldn't have been the origin of that or practiced it. But in his memoirs, he also acknowledges that he knew that Joseph Smith, his dad, Jr., had participated in some marriage ceremonies with other women other than Emma, but his position was that Joseph was never intimate with them, that he'd never slept with them, and never had physical relations with them, that it was some kind of a celestial marriage, something to go on in heaven, but not on earth. And for that, he then emphasized that there were no children, whoever claimed to be children of Joseph Smith Jr. I'm sorry, no children who claimed to be Joseph Smith, children of Joseph Smith Jr. And apparently at that time in history, at least publicly, there was no one who was making those allegations. I find some interest in that because now we know that with DNA studies that they have checked the DNA of several who subsequently claimed to be descendants of Joseph Smith Jr., and that those DNA studies, at least so far, have found that they were not related to Joseph Smith Jr. Whatever that, Joseph strongly opposed and fought against polygamy and also against the temple ordinances that had grown up in Nauvoo. He attacked the temple rituals other than baptism for the dead straight on, but most of the members of the reorganization were not interested in those anyway. The only one they were somewhat interested in was baptism for the dead. And there was this difference of opinion about that. And so Joseph III, as he often did, tried to find a middle ground. And what he basically said was that baptism for the dead was a practice that was legitimate in Nauvoo, but that you had to have a temple to do that. And we have no temple, and therefore we'll just have to wait to see in the future whether God wants that something for us to do again or not. And of course, over the period of time, it died out as older members died out. Although even today, sometimes in the community of Christ, you see that issue raised once in a while. I should point out that Joseph Smith III was successful in convincing the world that the reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints did not practice polygamy, was different than the LDS Church, and that he also convinced people that his father, especially the members of our church, convinced us that his father had never been and practiced, never been the author of or practiced polygamy. It's interesting to me that David, his younger brother, who had also been a missionary to Utah, David apparently came to the opposite conclusion. But one of the sadnesses in Joseph Smith III's life was that David gradually slipped into a mental illness and eventually had to be became a patient at a mental hospital in Elgin, Illinois, and passed away there. Joseph III commented at one point in time, at least, that he was very angry about the fact that some of the Utah members, they would make teasing or joking statements about, oh, the reason that they put David Hiram Smith in the mental institution was because they didn't want him talking about the fact that he thought his dad had practiced polygamy. But then finally, in 1890, then even the LDS Church, President Woodruff issued the manifesto that rejected plural marriage for that church as well. So Joseph felt like he had really won on that even though, that is still, when people say Mormonism, that's the thing that they think about first, usually anyway. As president of the church, he also emphasized a peace, the church being a peace church. When he was 13 years old, this is 1845, he made a statement that's one of my favorites of his. He said, "May God soon send the day when the curse of intolerance may be known no more in the land." One I think we ought to hold up more. Now, the reason for that statement, though, the context was that the members of the church who were followers of Brigham Young were harassing anybody who didn't support Brigham Young. And one of the old church members, who was a friend of Emma and the family, came to Nauvoo and to visit the family. While he was there, those what they call the whistling and whittling brigade, who would hound people out of town if they felt like they weren't supposed to be there, drove him out of town. And Joseph III was very upset about that. And so that's when he made that statement, "May God soon send the day when the curse of intolerance may be known no more in the land." Although to me it signifies greater meaning also, because although Joseph was anti-slavery his whole life, and as you are probably aware, that when the United States began, when the Civil War began in the United States, 1861, members in the Union, those who were not in the Confederacy, they drafted people to serve in the army, and Joseph at one point helped in that process of getting recruits for the Union Army. After he'd done that, though, he was quite concerned, because he began to think about that action in light of the fact that he was president of the church and God's teachings about that you should not kill. And so he came up, he prayed about it, came to a solution. And to me, it is a typical Joseph Smith III pragmatic conclusion. What he said was, what he told the church was that you should not enlist voluntarily to go and fight for the Union, because when there's killing, then that makes it a personal thing that you have chose to do. But if you get drafted, then you should go and support the Union, because at that point in time, then it becomes the sin of the nation and not an individual sin of yours. Locke tells stories about people who were still following that during World War II, and so it is something that is still once in a while comes up in the church. Although I haven't seen it discussed really as a part of our current analysis on where the church stands as a peace church. One of the things I would also point to, is Joseph, the fact that he exhibited a great deal of tolerance, and not only tolerance for people who disagreed with him in the church, but also a kind of ecumenical tolerance. He was very open to those of other faiths. And after the LDS Church rejected plural marriage in 1890, Joseph really began to emphasize that the ecumenical, the driving the work church towards what was more standard, centralized Christian Orthodox beliefs. He had earlier gotten rid of the esoteric things that were happening in Nauvoo, and after the polygamy got rid of and the LDS, he then even stronger urged us to become more involved in ecumenical matters. In 1888, he had the church attend a ecumenical meeting in Cincinnati, Ohio, and then in 1893, he attended the World's Parliament of Religions and said, what a wonderful thing it was. Would the time come when all the world were akin in faith? I wish I had the PowerPoint for this next one because it's a long quote of a sermon that Joseph Smith III gave in 1894. I apologize for the length of the quote, but let me read it to you. Joseph Smith III said, "We are not necessarily antagonistic to the truth that they of different faith may have. We have a right to examine all of them one by one. We have a right to select we have a right to select that from them which is true. We have a right to accept it or use it, and if it be true and antagonistic to that which we believe, we are under obligation to drop our opposition to it and to conform to that conform to that which is true that we may find elsewhere. We have the right to maintain our own faith, but differing faiths should be friendly, not of a compromising character. We should not strike hands with error, with wickedness or corruption, but we may easily strike hands with men so far as their truths are concerned and walk side by side with them in faith and friendliness. One of the problems of the day that we have to solve, one of the difficulties we have to meet, is extreme faith. I mean by this, that peculiar kind of faith that men have in the world that makes them bigots. Let me comment just for a minute about Joseph's view of Zion, because when Joseph had grown up in the church, he had experienced being driven out of Kirtland. He had experienced being driven out of Nauvoo, out of Far West. And although the church was welcomed by the church by the citizens of Illinois, but within 7 years, they had made the other people around them so angry that they were being driven out of there. Joseph, although he was being urged to designate a place for the church members to gather, was very reluctant to do that. He emphasized that Zion really had a spiritual nature. It was to change society by the way one lived. And for the first 10 years of his presidency, he declined to identify a place to gather. That began to change, and in 1869, the church authorized the creation of a joint stock company called the Order of Edict, which looked for and bought over 3,000 acres of land here in the Lamoni, what is now Lamoni. It was all prairie land at that point in time, with no town and very few farms. But he emphasized the reason they wanted a joint stock company was, first of all, he did not want the church to be involved in the leadership of that. He didn't want the church to take any sort of civil leadership in this gathering. He wanted to make land available in equitable terms. He did not want the church to be involved in land speculation. And he didn't want the church to be managing this community, and certainly didn't want them to be a political or military force. That concept was, Lonnie says, marginally acceptable to members, but it was also very acceptable to non-members. And so they created what became Lamoni, Iowa. Lamoni is always, is my understanding at least, from its earliest time, has been about half church members and half other religions, and still remains that today. But in my opinion, Lamoni is the only really Zionic experience truly successful for over 100 years, 150 years that the church has. On a personal note, I realize we're running short of time. On a personal note, I've often thought, I wish they wouldn't have then moved on to independence. But Joseph very much wanted to get the church back to independence, and that had been his goal since early in the presidency. But in Lamoni, they did a number of wonderful things, including the creation of Graceland in 1895. And Joseph was very, very excited that this was a non-denominational college, and that the word non-sectarian is chiseled on the cornerstone. When I read that, I thought, I'm going to have to go out to Graceland and look to see, is the word non-sectarian still chiseled on the cornerstone? I don't know, but at least it was originally, and I assume it still is. They also created a home for old folks, what they called Saints Home, here in 1896, and that was in operation until 1952. They created an orphanage in 1906 that was in operation until 1927, when federal law changed and discouraged the transportation of children across state lines. And in 1909, Joseph had moved to independence in 1906, and he felt strongly that that the church should openly move that direction, and he felt that was the correct move. However, and there in 1909, he directed the church to create what we known as the sanitarium, a hospital that was operated by the church. And I want to just take a minute to talk a tiny bit about that, because Jim Doty brought to my attention a fantastic story about how Joseph III, originally, they very much practiced and believed in administration for the sick, laying on hands for the sick. And he felt that the church members should either choose between medical services or administration. And at one point he had told Bertha he was not going to go out again and administer to people if they had the doctor come. Well, that night, he had gone to bed. He heard a man come into the house, walk up the stairs, and came into his room. And that man began to cross-examine Joseph Smith about how does healing occur and who is in charge of healing, whether it's by medical means or laying on of hands, and convinced Joseph III that he was wrong. So he changed his mind. Not only that, but he went ahead and directed the church to create a hospital and appointed Apostle Luff, Joseph Luff, as a medical director. He was a physician also and president to the church, or a physician to the church, sorry. So what do we say about Joseph Smith III? After 1886 to 1906 was just a really golden period in Lamoni, and then in 1906 he moved to independence. But he oversaw the growth of the church from about 1,000 members in 1860 to more than well, 23,000, more than almost 24,000 in 1980. He published the inspired version of the Bible. He established foreign missions in England, Switzerland, Italy, Society Islands, French Polynesia, Australia, Germany, Denmark, Sweden, and he overcame the teaching of polygamy with the Woodruff Manifesto in 1890. He created a Zionic community here in Lamoni and then moved the church to independence. He had moved the theology of the RLDS Church to be in line with mainland Christianity, and was very successful in that. He did have, I think if we were honest, we'd have to say there are some shortcomings. Although he established a very stable central administration for everything that was non-fiscal related, that he was never able to, and that as a part of that, created a orderly transition of presidencies from himself to through his three sons, but never really established the church with a financial stability. It was something he struggled with his whole life personally, and it's something that we still continue to struggle with in the church ourselves. As an attorney, he got in the church involved in lawsuits about the Kirtland Temple, and also about the temple lot and independence. In both cases, we lost those cases. We got rulings against us. However, in both cases, he felt that it was a win, and he presented them as a win, because in both cases, the judge accepted the concept that the reorganization was the lawful predecessor, the lawful successor of the early church. And in both of those, well, as far as the Kirtland Temple is concerned, we were successful there, but not because of that lawsuit. And the temple lot in Independence, you know that, and the building of the temple next to that subsequently. I've been amazed over the ability of the RLDS Community of Christ to change over a century of church life. And I wonder how each father would have reacted to where his son led the church. Joseph Smith III moved the church away from the theological practices of Nauvoo and back into mainstream Christian orthodoxy. His son, W. Wallace, began the transformation from the church, the concept of a one true church, and some of the misunderstandings we had about what happened in Nauvoo and the role of Joseph Smith Jr. Back towards, the W. Wallace began to transform the church away from those things and towards a more, I want to start to say modern, but that's not completely correct, a more liberal Protestant mainstream approach to theology and acceptance of other churches and other religious practices. Joseph III is one of the heroes in my church. He is a hero of mine, and he was the fulcrum on which the church turned in a time of crisis. And he still is a guiding light to the church. And that is my presentation.
Thank you, Stephen. Let me thank you for that presentation. And let me lead out with the first question. This is the Book of Mormon Perspectives Forum. What do you see as Joseph III's vantage point on the Book of Mormon? What would you perceive as his testimony?
I'm not seeing Stephen. I hope he didn't hang up his phone.
I think he might have.
I think you're right. Maybe he'll call back in. It was a wonderful presentation. I learned a lot about Joseph Smith III.
Well, let me begin to answer the question myself then, because I was responsible for the large Mormon in 1890. And then he was also responsible for the 1907 edition of the Book of Mormon. That is the pattern that's still very much in use today. He had his son and two others work manuscripts to compare.
Sorry, Paul, I hit the wrong button and got disconnected.
Well,
That's okay, Stephen.
good. I'm far more interested in your answer to my question than my answer. So please, what would you see as Joseph Smith III's testimony of the Book of Mormon?
Oh, it was a strong testimony of the Book of Mormon. And throughout his whole life, and when he went to the conference in Amboy in 1860, one of the things that he said to the group was that he believed in the Bible and of the Book of Mormon Doctrine and Covenants as ancillaries to the Bible. And he had a strong belief on that throughout his life.
Okay, and let me also ask for you to offer some clarification about the disagreements that he had with Gurley and
Briggs and Gurley.
Briggs in the 1880s.
Yeah, Jason Briggs. Jason Briggs. Go ahead.
Give us a sketch of that that rather pivotal disagreement.
Jason Briggs was an apostle, and so was Zenas Gurley Jr. And but they were both very liberal members of the church. They disagreed with Joseph about the Nauvoo story. They disagreed with Joseph about the inerrancy of Scripture, and that the Bible was the Bible, and that the Scriptures, and they specifically talked about the Bible. I don't know, but I think they would have included, and they did. I come to think of it, yes, they did include the Book of Mormon, especially the Doctrine and Covenants, as not inerrant revelation voice of God, but that it had to come through people and reflected people in the context of their times. They wanted to argue their points of view, which were not well accepted by other members of the church. They wanted to be able to argue those in the Herald. Jason Briggs, when he headed up a mission into Utah early on, and he had his own magazine, or his own newspaper, The Messenger, if I remember correctly, in which he talked about those things. And when Joseph, it created enough controversy that Joseph eventually stopped the publication of that periodical. And so Briggs wanted to be able to argue those things in the Herald, and Joseph was not willing to do that. And for over 10 years, this started, let me find it in my notes, started in about 1870 and ran until about 1885. For almost 15 years, this controversy ran. And periodically, the church in conference assembled would refuse to affirm the callings of Jason Briggs and Zenas Gurley Jr. as members of the Quorum of 12. And then Joseph would work to get the troubled waters smoothed over and get them back and recognized as active members of the Quorum of 12. And this happened 2 or 3 times. And finally, in 1885, Briggs and Gurley both asked for, the church had, the conference assembled, had proposed a resolution that would have forced them to accept the inerrancy of Scripture, for example. And so Briggs and Gurley asked to, Briggs and Gurley asked if they could resign honorably from membership in the church, and they did. But as you read that story, it is amazing to me how patient and how hard Joseph Smith III worked to try to prevent schism in the church as a result of that, and largely was successful in preventing schism arising from that.
Thank you. Let me urge people to go to the reactions icon at the bottom of the page and raise your hands, raise your questions, your comments. There's so much more to learn about Joseph Smith III, and here we have one of the world's experts on him. To be able to have that resource is a delight. So please take advantage. There we have one for Wednesday.
Hello. First, I want to thank you for your presentation. I have done some research around the life of Joseph Smith III, so it's always great to get some more information. I definitely learned some new things. I have a question further on Joseph Smith III's testimony of Mormonism. So I know that, so Emma had him raised away from the church. And I believe he attended Methodist services and maybe some other. And then later on, when he studied Mormonism, he came to the conclusion that I believe, if the thing I read right, was that pre-Nauvoo Mormonism rang true. So like in that in-between time, do you have any further, was like Emma teaching them restoration scripture at home, or what was their, I know they had little exposure, but what was Joseph Smith III and his siblings, what was their exposure to the church their father founded?
Okay. There are a number of different points there, so if I miss some of them, feel free to come back to what I missed. You're correct that they were not raised within the church, but I don't think it was so much a choice of Emma as much as it was the fact that there was no church available in Nauvoo. The church had left Nauvoo, and there were no Mormon, if you want to call it that, remnants meeting in Nauvoo. So they did attend both Presbyterian and Methodist church. Joseph, Emma, and Major Bideman were married Methodist church by Methodist minister, and Joseph and Emmeline, Joseph Smith III and Emmeline, were married by a Presbyterian minister. So I think but in addition to that, there's a strong Catholic heritage in Nauvoo that goes back to the German and French immigrants who came to Nauvoo. And Joseph, I think, was very deeply exposed to all of these other ways of thinking, other church denominations. And I think it certainly had a part to do with his emphasis on basically ecumenism, if that's the right way to say that word, particularly after the controversy over plural marriage that ended basically in 1890. Joseph, to the best of I've been able to determine, there's no record that Emma taught her boys or the daughter, her daughter, church doctrine. In 1853, which is the same year that Joseph III received that first vision in the mansion house of the two options were open to him, and is told he's going to have to choose. That same year prior to that vision, some church members on their way to Utah had stopped by Nauvoo, and one of them had talked with Joseph III and had chastised him for not preparing himself for leadership in the church. Joseph apparently, it made quite an impression on Joseph, and for the next 2 years, he began to study diligently all the books and materials that he could find on the church, and became, during that time, one of the most knowledgeable people about the whole issues of Mormonism and their doctrines in the Nauvoo area. So that was that began prior to the vision. But he never grew up, as you say, in the church. It was interesting to me when he married Bertha Madison Smith in 1869. He made the comment at one point in time that Bertha, who grew up in the church, was much more familiar with the scriptures than he was, which I thought was an interesting statement. And it sounds like maybe he did get some advice, suggestions from Emma along the way. Emma was an open, I'm getting sidetracked here. Emma was an open and very talkative person. She was, I don't want to get into all the differences about his 3 wives, his 3 successive wives, but I'm not sure whether that answered your question or not.
It certainly provided me some more information, and thank you for the time of that they weren't necessarily I guess learning restoration theology in their childhoods.
Yeah. One other one I just would add to that comment, and that is that in 1856, after his second vision, when Zenas Gurley Jr. and Briggs' son came to Nauvoo to deliver the message from the reorganization to Joseph. And then when Zenas Gurley Jr. stayed for a year, one of the things they did during that year was they had a lot of talk and studies about the church and its doctrines. So he was fairly familiar with even before he became president of the church.
Okay, thank you.
Let me add to that ecumenical note that the Moffat family, who has lived in Nauvoo since 1823, and Dan Moffat still lives in the Moffat home, which is 2 miles south of the town, right on the riverbank. Matter of fact, their house was marked by Robert Lee when he made his map of the Des Moines Rapids. And so that's how we happen to know that Water Street went all the way down to Moffat's house and up to the times and seasons. Anyway, the fact that the Moffats tell us that their ancestor was baptized by the Catholic priest in the Nauvoo temple with Joseph Smith Jr.'s permission is the kind of ecumenical comment that I think we don't often hear. But that tradition appears to have merit to be valid. But again, that's a bit striking that Joseph Smith Jr. allowed the Catholic priest to baptize the Moffat household in the Nauvoo temple as Catholic. And so I think we need to appreciate that there was more of an ecumenical movement, even in Joseph Smith's thinking, at least at times, and there I think is evidence of it. Let me also respond to Wednesday's question. My own study of the background would support what Stephen has said. That year, though, with Edmund Briggs staying in Nauvoo to talk with Joseph and share with him about the gospel as understood from his background was, I think, a pivotal educational point. That was after he had been going to try to study law. He was, at the time, he was getting married. And so it was a transitional time for him, and I think a very important set of lessons. But he had read, rather significantly, John Bernheisel had provided him with a great deal of literature, and John Bernheisel had stayed in the mansion house with him from 1843 until 1847. And then after he went west, he continued to drop by Nauvoo and drop off books and journals and so forth to help educate young Joseph, because the two of them had a very fond relationship. And so that was a widespread educational resource that I think few people appreciate.
Okay. Jerry Broadus had his hand up. Jerry.
You know, church history says to me that Joseph Smith III was set apart by his father in that prison where they were when he was 12, right? Am I
Yes.
right or wrong?
Because he wasn't 12 yet, but when he was 12, then yes. When he was 11 years old in his 12th year, he was then set apart in the red brick store also.
Okay. Well, he knew at that age, he knew that God was calling him. He wasn't ready for all that. I can see if I were in a house where continually people were trying to come against my dad because of his faith and try to destroy him everywhere they could, that I wouldn't want much part of it either until I grew old enough to study it out in my own mind and have an experience with it. And Emma kept saying that he didn't have any more wives. And she was the one that could say whether that was true or not, I would believe. And knowing how the Mormon church from Salt Lake City tries to influence us to believe certain ways and put all this stuff out in the air, that each one of them had proven not to be. So, I'm a long ways from that history, whether there was some stories given that wasn't true or not, but I know my Book of Mormon teaches against it. So, when I read it for myself, I couldn't put it down. Holy Spirit was witnessing to me from the beginning to the end, and it still does. It's marked all over. I believe it is Holy Writ. I believe it, the inspired version is true. I believe the Doctrine and Covenants is true. And, I've often tried to share it with people, and they heard all of these stories about polygamy and they want to run away from everything. And that Book of Mormon don't teach anything about it except against it. That's all I want to say.
Thank you, Jerry. Wednesday, go ahead.
If Steve doesn't want to respond, Jerry, I'd like to. You are right that we have good historical record to indicate that Joseph III was recognized by his father to be his successor while Joseph Jr. was in the Liberty Jail. Then we also have a very good documentation of the setting of young Joseph apart in the red brick store. And there's at least an allegation of that being confirmed just before Joseph Smith left the mansion house to go to Carthage to be assassinated. And so there's a adequate evidence. But as you suggest, young Joseph at 11 years old at the time his father was assassinated, clearly was not in a position of trying to assume leadership. And as a matter of fact, if you can imagine, and to me, it's so poignant that the two bodies were laid out in the mansion house dining room, and they had to burn vinegar and sugar and try to hide the odor of the bodies because it was hot June weather, and they'd been shot on the 27th and the 29th when the people came through. The odors were getting pretty bad, dripping on the floor, and young Joseph had to smell that. My experience is when you smell death up close, it doesn't get out of your nostrils very quick.
The other comment I would just add is that although we don't know how much it was a part of his thinking up until about 1853, but when he began to court Emmeline, one of the things when he proposed to her was that he told her that he had this, he'd been set apart for this, and that at some point he might want to participate in the church in a role of leadership, and that he had to be free to do that. And it was a condition of his proposal to her that he had that freedom to do that. So it was in his mind, certainly in his mind, even before 1860.
Okay, is it okay for Wednesday's question? Go ahead.
I beg your pardon?
Wednesday has a question. Go ahead. You're muted.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
So my question is, so during the Civil War, this is what eventually led to Doctrine and Covenants 116. The church members asked him about the question of Black men and priesthood authority. So in that, I think, in the way that 116 is written in my study, I find that it's qualified, and Joseph Smith III was a rather pragmatic, as you said, very pragmatic. And so my theory there is it's written in a way to avoid schism in the church. What do you think about that? Do you think that he was worried about schism at the time of Doctrine and Covenants 116?
I think he very much was concerned about that. This is 1866, the year after the Civil War had been completed. And Standing High Council had gotten together and were they wanted to issue a statement about the role of Black Americans in the church. And they could not come to any sort of agreement. Some wanted to restrict, some wanted no restrictions. They couldn't come to agreement, so they asked Joseph to consider that and ask the Lord. And he came back with that section, which says that in today's word, we would say all are called, but be not hasty, and which is not, that's not, I mean, that was during the Reconstruction years. I think there's good reason not to move in haste. but then he also made the statement that some are called to minister to their own race. And so that it resulted in segregated churches was primarily the practice in our church up until recent years, up until last 50, 60, 70 years. And as you may be aware that there's a motion or a resolution in the church for consideration of our World Church Conference in April that would move that section 116, I think that's right. I don't have my notes there, to the historical section because of that limitation. But I don't know. He was very much opposed to slavery. He was very supportive of the Civil War in his own way. And when he was Justice of the Peace, he refused to help a slave owner from Missouri who wanted his help capturing a slave, or wanted his help as Justice of the Peace to capture an escaped slave. And Joseph told him there wasn't any laws, they couldn't make a law in the United States that would force him to do that, and that if he had his way, if he hadn't seen this escaped slave, but if he had, he would have given him resources to continue him on his way. But that's aside from the heart of your question, which is, okay, why did he appear to support the concept of segregated congregations, segregated priesthood? And I think you're correct. I think that he was concerned about what would happen if they didn't do that. I think it was a pragmatic decision, and I don't know whether he could have. Well, I'm sure he could have. I don't know. I guess what we can say is that it was something that he apparently struggled with, and that was the pragmatic conclusion that he reached.
Go ahead, Winsy.
Okay. Thank you. Yes, I knew a good bit about his opinions on slavery, and I did I thought it was really cool of him not to, that he, at the risk of being punished, did not enforce the Fugitive Slave Act. So thank you. I can't remember, it's like no court in the land is fast enough, or no something is swift enough to make a slave catcher out of me. Yeah, but that was cool. Thank you.
Steve, let me follow up on her question though, because section 116, the last line, if I recall correctly, says, "I, the Lord, have spoken it." And as I look at the document signed by Charles Derry, Secretary of the Quorum of 12, that was a paragraph. Whereas today in the Doctrine and Covenants, it's attached to paragraph 4. I'm wondering if you perceive that as being a significant factor. I'm wondering if that means the I, the Lord, has spoken it simply refers to the earlier reference that you should allow African Americans to be ordained, and I, the Lord, has spoken it, or is it more technically referring to the fourth paragraph, indicating you should use caution?
It's the whole thing. So the original, the hand-printed manuscript is a separate line, and that would make it refer to the entire section. It was just in the printer manuscript. They don't like that single line, and so it seems in the printer manuscript it got moved into the to the previous verse. You're in luck. If you want to know my opinions, I did a whole research project on it. There's an entire article. I'd be happy to share it in the chat. But thank you.
Go ahead and share in the discussion. It's perfectly welcome. And thank you for doing your research.
Yes.
Other questions and comments for Steve? Steve, clearly the archaeologist wants to inquire, what do you think are the archaeological prospects for a more complete, comprehensive restoration of Liberty Hall?
Paul, can I, there are a number of parts to that question. And I need to give you a call to talk to you about that in the summer also. So can we talk about that separately if you don't mind?
Okay. Well, I wanted to give it a little bit of a nudge, because I'm
Yeah.
excited to see us make some progress on that. I do know that we've got a lot of questions to be answered first.
We did have a request in the chat also that if it's at all possible, Steve, if you can make the PowerPoint available to Robert so that it can be put with the presentation for tonight. Folks were hoping that that would be made available if possible.
I did send it to Robert in an email, but I was thinking about that later. It is such a large file that quite often our carrier will refuse emails that have attached such a large file. So if Robert Robert and I'll try to talk with Robert and figure out how to do that.
Steve, I will help you out here and now. I think you have a good memory, and there is a website called WeTransfer. Google WeTransfer.com. That should give you as a website where you can add files, and all those files go then as well, and then you can either send it as an email to one person. That's the thing that I never do. Or you can you have the option also to receive a link, and I always work with WeTransfer, and I get the link, and then whoever has that link can download those files directly from WeTransfer. So there we have no problems with like Gmail or other mail systems that limit the file sizes to 20 or 50 megabits sometimes. So a WeTransfer link is always a safe way to do it.
Okay.
And I didn't want to talk about this before because things were going to happen here, and it was going all right, although we didn't have the PowerPoint. But I said, don't interrupt the speaker. The speaker is doing a great job and a good job. You did a very well job. And then, of course, I let the speaker just to finish his thing and stipulate this at the end.
Paul, thank you for letting me be a part of the program tonight, and I appreciate sharing Liberty Hall. Hope any time that you're in the neighborhood, any of you'll stop by Liberty Hall. We can chat and you can visit, and we'll be happy to show you through and around the site.
Okay.
Did
Thanks.
you have
Thank you
time
all.
for one more question, Stephen?
Sure.
Go ahead, Wednesday.
Oh, earlier you were speaking on Joseph Smith the third and this being a peace church. I was just wondering, did he ever write about maybe how his the events in his childhood influenced that? Did he ever maybe in a journal or something?
I'm sorry, did you write about what?
I guess his reasoning for making a peace church, I assume the events in his childhood that were very warlike with like Nabu Leaf and Zion's Camp. Did he ever write about maybe the effect it had on him or it relating to it being a peace church? Did he ever write on that?
I can't think of anything. Paul, do you?
I would cite his experience in Carthage about 1893, close to 50 years after the assassination. He was in Carthage and saw this old gentleman in a wheelchair and greeted him, and I think shook hands with him. And it was Thomas Sharp, the man who was more responsible perhaps than anyone else for the assassination of his father. Joseph III took quite a lot of heat from people who thought he had no business trying to be friendly with Thomas Sharp. And Joseph III very clear about that, indicating that we are called by Christ to be people of peace. And if we can't even speak with people that we disagree with or can't heal the wounds of our past, then we don't have much of a right to the future.
I would also think that perhaps as it would relate to his concepts of Zion, that much more than a physical location, the purpose of Zion is to enable people to live in a way that carries out Christian principles, would be very much a part of that.
Yeah,
And
go ahead.
And I was going to say, the way he organized Lamoni so that it would prevent conflict between church members and others outside the church.
Well, and it was in Lamoni from the Herald House, as I recall, looking west out of the Herald House window, that he recalled that vision that he'd seen in 1853. And here he was,
Yeah.
the rural imagery that he had seen when he had that first vision.
Yes.
A community of peace.
Thank you, Paul. Appreciate the opportunity tonight and hope all of you have a wonderful night and day.
Thank you, Steve, for sharing with us. I want to express my appreciation to everyone for the comments and questions and good attention. Next week, we'll have the review of G5, 6, 7, and 8, 9. And we'll get to hear from Wednesday on the Christian, Zionism, David on marriage, myself on the Peace Church, Bill Gunlock on refugees. And so that should be a fun presentation just to get acquainted with what the delegates are considering in the month ahead. I do have an open spot in April if somebody would like to claim it for a presentation. I would like to get that filled because it's just a month out now, and for some reason I've been distracted for the last month to the point that I'm trying to book people and I need to catch up. Or else fill it myself. Okay, we'll work it out. Well, thank you all. Good night. The Lord is watching over you. Good night. His blessings go before you. Good night. And we'll be praying for you. So good night. May God bless you.
Thank you, Paul.
Amen.
Thank you, Paul.